All right, so in case you were not here on the 29th, this is what we did for the day. We went over the schedule and then a couple of the opportunities, and then I gave you time to get your lecture notes ready. So what was this lecture about today? World War II on the home front. So we want to start off with talking about the United States staying out of the war. So much of the United States, as we finished World War I, they were not too happy. As we've kind of talked about in class, they felt like, why did we just send over 116,000 people to go and die in this war in Europe? How did it really affect us? So they didn't see any immediate return, so they felt like it was kind of a waste. So as we kind of talked about, the United States entered an isolationist period, obviously coming from the word isolation. They wanted to stay separate from the rest of the world. They wanted Europe to kind of stay across the ocean and not bother us with their problems. So to put this into effect, Congress is going to pass neutrality acts in the 1930s that prevent us from trading with nations at war. So those will come into effect a lot later with kind of what we talked about with those lend-lease policies the other day. So we had laws intact that said we can't trade with nations at war to keep us isolationist. However, what is going to bring us into the war, as we did briefly talk about again in the other lesson, Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. President Roosevelt is going to call it a day that shall live in infamy, and he is going to declare war the next day. So in this war, there are going to be 16 million Americans that serve out of a population of 113 million. So that's over 10%, right? So again, why does Pearl Harbor happen? Well, Japan wanted a lot of oil and other resources, and the US kind of did this embargo on them, but Japan knew they could take over islands in the surrounding area, but the United States would not be supporting it. So as a way to buy time, so basically they bombed the United States, they bombed us because it was going to take out a large part of our Navy, so we wouldn't be able to do anything to protect all those islands in the East Indies. This gave Japan like 6 months to kind of conquer all those islands and get all the raw materials they needed. So for them, it kind of was a success. Other historians will say it was Japan also trying to scare us into surrendering earlier on. So the part of them being able to conquer islands to get the raw materials is true, and that is how it happens, but it obviously does not scare the US out of surrendering to Japan, and it draws us into the war completely. So what are some of the domestic changes that are going to happen? Roosevelt understands the war needed support from the American people. So he is going to make this an American war. For him, especially Pearl Harbor is going to be effective because the American people are going to feel like we are under attack. It's unlike World War I, although they had that Zimmerman telegram, and Lusitania, but this is more of a direct attack on America. So he wants them to feel like we all need to support it. One of the big reasons why is that people have to accept rationing, both for food and gas, because we do need those materials to be sending overseas or helping out the war effort. But also during this wartime period, there is going to be a lot of spending, which effectively ends the Great Depression. There are a lot of other factors that go into that, but we start spending so much money on war production. It provides all these jobs for people. Obviously, there was the New Deal before that. That was also giving jobs to people, but this is a bigger effort and more visual to everyone. And also taxes are going to provide 45% of the revenue, but also they're going to use war bonds to get the rest of the funding. What is a war bond? It's basically something where an average American citizen can buy it, and after a certain amount of time, they cash it back in with the government and they get interest, they get extra money. So basically they're lending the government money to use on this. The reason I have these pennies is to show that copper was being rationed also. So you can actually still find World War II era pennies that don't have any copper in it. They are silver, like a nickel. So how's it going to affect other groups in America? So one of the biggest things is going to be the Zoot Suit riots. So in the 1930s, there were roughly 3 million Mexican Americans living in the United States. And in 1942, there's the Sleepy Lagoon trial that is going to arrest over 600 Mexican American teens. So we can already see there's this starting to be unrest among, especially in California, but there's going to be this big unrest with targeting Mexican Americans at this time. There's a big thing where they are seen not as American, even though most of them are going to be born here. But it's just kind of that xenophobia that we still continue to see. So in the summer of 1943, a group of sailors are going to claim they are attacked by a group of Zoot Suiters. What is a Zoot Suit? It was basically a fashion at the time that became very popular among Mexican Americans. Try to think of like what Al Pacino wore. And so this group of sailors stationed in Southern California are going to say they got attacked by these Mexican Americans. There's not really any evidence of this actually happening. But what happens as a result is that the next day there are a lot of Navy men who are going to travel to Mexican neighborhoods and begin attacking anyone wearing Zoot Suits. So again, that was a really common fashion at the time, especially for Mexican Americans. So they're really just attacking this whole group of people. And as a result of these riots, attacks, the police are going to arrest over 500 Mexican Americans, but no servicemen are going to be arrested, even though evidence shows they were the ones starting all the attacks. And so as a protest, this is going to set off attacks in 7 US cities. And how are Asian Americans affected during this time period? Well, the biggest one is going to be Japanese internment camps. So in 1940, there were roughly 275,000 Japanese Americans living in the United States and Hawaii. In 1942, obviously 1941, Pearl Harbor happens, and that was Japan attacking us. But so in 1942, as a response, Roosevelt is going to declare military areas, the ability to exclude any and all persons from these areas. So basically, they'll say anyone along this whole coast, that's going to be considered a military area. We have the right to relocate or move anyone from those areas. So that is where the majority of Japanese Americans are really going to be living, other than Hawaii, which doesn't get put under these restrictions. So there's going to be over 110,000 people forced into these camps. They're basically given almost no notice, very little notice. They could only bring what they could carry. So these Japanese Americans, some of them who had been here for decades, are now just being forced to give up all their possessions and go to basically not concentration camps, because they're not executing them, but they're being forced into these desert areas to basically be on lockdown for the duration of the war. They don't get released until 1944, and there's not really going to be full release until 1945. There's a lot more that goes into this, but that's all I'll be telling you for today. So then take the rest of the time to complete your reflection, and there is an exit ticket at the end of the day.